September came, and with it the dark nights. We took on board the mines. At dusk, the rattling went out to sea. The ship tilted sharply at a bend, but not a single mine moved. The big black balls on heavy carts were securely fastened to the rails. Periscope. Submarine. A sailor rushed from the side rail to the aft superstructure. We're going to him. Where's the periscope? Over there. Sailor Stepanishov was pointing towards the stern with a trembling hand. He's looking out of the water. But there was nothing suspicious behind the stern, though a gaunt bough of a tree trunk, abandoned from nowhere, was sticking out of the water. It was a stovepipe. Ashamed, Stepanishov ran to the cabin. What an alarmist. Afonin grumbled angrily. I was curious. I went down to the fourth cabin, where the turbine drivers lived. Stepanishov still hadn't come to his senses. He sat pale, nervously intertwining his fingers until his joints crunched. He was depressed, confused. But I had no pity for him. I wanted to go over and give him a good slap. Of course, I realized that such a measure would not add an iota of courage to the coward. But my hands itched, I confess. My watch was still a while off. I went up to the cabin again. The thick darkness of the September night covered the sea. When the narrow sickle of the moon pierced into the clouds, our ships passed the Rybaki Peninsula with their distinctive lights off. Over the shore, a glow blazed. Our marines were fighting on the Muster Tunchery Ridge. My thoughts returned to Stepanishov again. Where did he get this cowardice from? He was drafted together with Afonin and Osipov. Together they got on the ship. But they were completely different, brave, restrained. Stepanishov is only dashing and hot on shore, but at sea he's like a wet hen. The sea silently, and somehow offensively indifferent, rocked us like a tired nurse of an unloved child. But it was impossible to doze off. At any minute fascist ships could appear, and then there would be no fight. And a battle, when there are mines on board, is a terrible thing. Lieutenant Vladimir Fyodorovich Kruglov, commander of the mine torpedo warfare unit, was seated at the very cut of the stern, on the ribbed guards of large depth bombs. In his hands the dial of the stopwatch flickered with blue light. Not far from the officer, the miners froze at the mine's extreme to the cut of the stern. They were joined by rangefinders Sergei Gritsai and Roman Nikulin, artillery electricians Pavel Lapshinov and Viktor Mostetsov, sightseers Nikolai Shvets and I, who were free from watch, to help them to cope with the upcoming case faster. It was quiet all around. Only from the direction of Rybachigo rolled the uneven rumble of cannonade. Behind the stern, in the keel jet of the Gremichny, fireflies were circling. The sea was phosphorescent. A blue signal lamp flashed and went out. It was an order from the bridge. Get ready. Lieutenant Kruglov got up from his seat. To places. Put mines. The destroyer slowed down. The white trail of water disturbed by propellers stretched far astern. The lieutenant commanded in an even voice. Right. Left. The deck of the Gremichny buzzed with rolling mines. Someone was hit. A muffled swearing was heard. Damn it, you'll crush them. Torpedo man Savely Litvinov laughed good-naturedly and explained. I told you half undra, and you climb out of the hatch right under the mine. I want to help you. The mines moved relentlessly toward the stern. No more conversations were heard, except for the orders of Lieutenant Kruglov and the soft voice of the torpedo officer Ivanov. Roll up. At the same time, Petty Officer Ivanov himself spread his arms wide, as if he was going to pick up a mine and throw it overboard. The heavy balls on the carts plunged into the water and disappeared. Then, when the drum uncoiled the mineshaft, a thin steel cable, they floated to the surface, dotted with the foamy path left by the propellers. And only after some time, when the trolley anchor pulled the rope, the mine went to the specified depth. And at the stern we could still hear the businesslike voice of Lieutenant Kruglov. Right. Arrived. The last mine rolled off the rails. Kruglov breathed a sigh of relief and reported to Gurin by telephone. Putting mines is finished. Everything is in order. Our ship withdrew to the sea to cover destroyers Kuibyshev and Uritsky, which also began to lay mines. On the sea still we did not notice anything suspicious. The enemy shore was silent. Apparently the fascist observers did not even assume that our ships can work under their very noses. The enemy was this time more careless than we thought. By morning we returned to the base. The return trip was far from smooth. There was a breakdown in the car through the fault of sailor Stepanishev. Fear again failed us. While the mines were being laid, he was as if on pins and needles. As a result, he made an incorrect switching of valves. The same day he was written off our ship. No one felt sorry for him, no one sympathized with him. Sailors of the Gremichny are not the way with cowards. The sailors rejoiced the real fighting began. Already 4 times we went out for mine laying. We raided the coast occupied by the enemy. In one of the official documents of 1941 about the combat actions of our crew, it is laconically recorded. September 18th, 1941. The destroyer Gremichny from 1 hour 30 minutes to 3 hours, 00 minutes conducted artillery shelling of the enemy's location in the area of the western Litsa Bay. According to the observation of the adjusters and the estimate of the Land Command, 2 Nazi batteries and up to a battalion of mountain huntsmen were destroyed. September 20th. The destroyer Gremichny supported the flank of the Red Army in the area of Zapadnya Litsa Bay with artillery fire, shelling enemy concentrations. September 22nd and 29. The destroyer Gremichny shelled enemy troop concentrations in the area of the collective farm Bolshaya Litsa. During October, the destroyers Gremichny and Sokrishitelny shelled the coast occupied by the enemy several times. November 2nd. The destroyer Gremichny made a night artillery raid on enemy positions in the vicinity of Zapadnaya Litsa Bay, firing about 100 shells. November 9th. The destroyers Gremichny and Sokrishitelny, accompanied by 3 sea hunters, made a night artillery bombardment of enemy concentrations. Good results were noted. Exactly the same task was performed by our ship on November 16th and 17th. Then I had a chance to be in touch with the combat posts of the artillery unit, and the central pointing of the main caliber guns was carried out by my comrades Nikolai Shefets and Vasily Kubansky. Both of them were dexterous and skillful gunners who understood each other in battle from half a word of mouth. The autumn polar sky was frowning more and more often. Cold rain was interspersed with wet snow. The sailors became despondent. But the weather was not the reason. The disappointing reports from the fronts were depressing. In the south our troops were retreating inland. When the loudspeaker went silent, depressed voices were heard in the wardroom. My town has been taken over by the fascists. When will it all end? When will we finally give the fascists a smack in the face and drive them westward? Is the enemy really so strong that nothing can stop him? No, we didn't believe that. After all, here in the north, the enemy failed to break through deep into our territory. The Red Army units and Marines of the Northern Fleet became a wall on the line of the state border. On the hills of the polar regions, the Soviet fighters did not retreat a single step. Stop, you bastard. Here stand the sailors, said the North Sea sailors, firing at the attacking enemy. We enthusiastically went to make artillery strikes on enemy positions. This was a concrete help to our soldiers and sailors fighting ashore. The ship allocated a special group to communicate with the Marines and transfer corrective data to the ship. Everyone dreamed of getting into it. This time the commander assigned to it Lieutenant Boris Vladimirovich Gavrilov, signalman Veniamin Onukov, radio operators Peter Teslenko and Nikolai Marshagin. At night the ship anchored in a deserted bay surrounded by cliffs. A boat was lowered. Our comrades with a portable radio got down in it. Soon the dinghy departed from the side of the Gremichny and disappeared into the darkness. Only the splashes of oars still came to our ears, and the surf murmured monotonously in the distance. An hour passed. The wind dispersed the clouds, and the high sky, studded with stars, opened. Then in the dark depths of the sky a wide bright strip with a fringe at the bottom unfolded, flashed all the colours of the rainbow, curled up, opened again to the whole horizon. The aurora borealis. Many times I have observed it, and each time I have felt the thrill. In the light of the aurora borealis, the bay seemed to expand. The sharp peaks of the rocks became visible. Somewhere there, among the rocks, our comrades are making their way. We were busy at the command Dela station. Together with navigational electricians, we checked the consistency of devices for firing on the shore. The commander of the artillery combat unit, Senior Lieutenant Olymp Ivanovich Rudakov, went around the guns. And the shore group remained silent. Later, Gavrilov and his comrades told about their adventures. They wandered for a long time on the tundra. On the way there were huge boulders and swamps, dense bush, precipices and rises. The men often fell, their faces and hands were sore from scratches, and their knees were aching. The lieutenant led the group by compass. The polar aurora helped its glow illuminated the road. They went faster and smoother. But it was still difficult to walk. When they were climbing up the mountain, rocks were rolling from under their feet. In the silence of the night, their noise was deafening. Gavrilov hurried the sailors. The hardest of all was Marshigin, who was carrying a radio behind his back. Jumping over bumps and rocks, he was always thinking how not to harm his burden. The light in the sky went out. The darkness around them thickened. The sailors crossed another chain of granite rocks. Gavrilov began to be tormented by doubt. Were they lost? Why hadn't they met with the marine liaison until now? A firefight was heard in the distance, so it was a short distance to the front line. The lieutenant raised his pistol and fired into the air. A dark silhouette of a man appeared from behind a large boulder. They exchanged passwords, their own. Teslenko and Marshagin quickly turned the radio, but they failed to establish contact with the Gremichny. Gavrilov was annoyed. Every minute was precious. "We need to stretch the antenna on the top of the hill," suggested Teslenko. "Hurry, hurry." Lieutenant hurried the radio operators. "After all, the infantry is waiting for our fire." Finally, Gremichny and the command post of the front line were called back. The first data reported by the infantrymen were transmitted to the destroyer, and barely radio operators had time to do it, as somewhere behind the hills lightning flashed. Then it rumbled around, rumbled very close. The first shells from Gremichny fell on the enemy. Lieutenant in the telephone receiver heard the voice of a distant comrade infantryman. "Excellent. Mortar battery ordered to live long. The dugouts are covered. Come on, brother, fire some more." Here came the machine gunners. And the artillerymen of Gremichny blasted in such a way that the same cheerful infantryman reported in a sing-songy voice. "Good cover. Let's do it again." A continuous rumble came from the sea. The artillerymen of the burden opened a barrage of fire. "Give more. Crush them." By morning, from the front line transmitted that the Marines are very pleased with our fire and thanked for their help. Only after that Lieutenant Gavrilov said to his subordinates, "Gather round, comrades. We have worked hard today, not in vain." The air shook. One, another. 2 explosions shook the neighborhood. The lieutenant and the sailors looked anxiously toward the bay. Was it not the rattle that had happened? But the jagged mountains covered the fjord. The battle alarm caught sailor Valentin Zabnin in the 5th cabin, where he went down to warm up. Dressing on the move, the gunner rushed to the cannon, which was already turning toward an invisible target. The sailor soon got used to the darkness. In the flash of a blue light bulb saw the shells neatly stacked on the deck. Zabnin bent down, picked up a weighty shell and put it on the tray. A howler sounded sharply. Rattling shuddered from the volley, and off it went. Zabnin threw a shell into the tray and immediately snatched up a new one, fed to the upper deck by the elevator. At the same time, the sailor did not forget to close his eyes when the blue light bulb lit up. It warned now there would be a salvo if you did not close your eyes in time. The gun flashes would blind you, and you would not soon get used to the night darkness again. At the next flashing of the blue light, Zabnin noticed a white inscription on the dark metal of the shell. It was chalked out for Moscow, and next to it was a smaller inscription for Staraya Russa. Zabnin guessed that these inscriptions were made by the boiler machinist German Sinitsyn, who was a loader of the artillery elevator, according to the combat schedule. Sinitsyn was drafted into the navy from an old Russian town, for which he was now taking revenge on the hated enemy. Having fed the shell, Zabnin shouted into the intercom. Sinitsyn. Right for Leningrad. And for Kiev, for Minsk, voices were heard. For Smolensk. Tovzya, shouted the gun commander a phone-in and raised his hand as a habit, although no one could see his gesture in the darkness. And immediately the howler rang out. The thunder of the volley hit his ears painfully. The gun of petty officer of the second article, Nikolai Efonin, clearly maintained a high rate of fire. The crews of petty officers Phil, Konyakin and Tursky were not lagging behind. The gunners of the fourth gun, Pavlushkin and Nestorovsky, worked silently. Now they had one concern: to accurately align the arrows of the devices. And they rotated and rotated the wheels, not noticing anything around them. Their muscles were aching from the strain. There was a case when the elevator fuse blew. Artillerymen had to manually drive the feed mechanism. It was a hellish labour. But the gun's rate of fire was not reduced. Shooting with short breaks continued all night. Dawn was already glimmering over the hills. The ship moved at a slow pace to the throat of the fjord. Sailors and petty officers on the ute encircled Commissar Rozhkov. The senior political officer told them. Lieutenant Gavrilov reports that we, with our fire, covered the fascist G-Zots and dugouts, smashed the mortar battery and the command post. And turning to Zabnin, who once sought to be discharged from the ship to the land front, Rozhkov added, "We do not see the enemy in the eye, but we beat him to death, just like our friends on the front line." Gremichny, with the swift contours of the narrow hull, the shovel-shaped turret of the rangefinder post, and the wide trumpet tilted slightly backward, was moving along the quiet shore. Suddenly the sky in the west lit up with bright flashes. 2 deafening explosions were heard. Perhaps this is our work. Kormenko got up. No other way than the fascists' ammunition is bursting. The machinist was right infantryman from the front reported the same thing. In the evening, when the rested sailors put the guns in order and cleaned up, Navigator Senior Lieutenant Ivashenko appeared on the ute. He took a notebook out of his pocket. "Sailors, listen to what I've written. Only agreement if it's bad, speak directly. All right?" "All right," came from all sides. The navigator, visibly worried, began to read. The Barents Sea shook with the northwest. We set a course for foreign shores and left the base to fight a fiery dispute. In the stormy night to destroy the enemy. On the bridge in the snowy and cloudy twilight, where the phosphorus of the instruments shines in circles, the familiar figure of an artilleryman, a whole head taller than the others. It's our senior Lieutenant Rudakov. The artilleryman guessed at once. That's right. Quiet. The Barents Sea has travelled many miles. The navigator marked the exact places. And suddenly a silhouette. Battle alarm. The ship turned around, the men at their posts, shells in the barrels, and with a quick movement. The pistons of the breech loaders are clicked. Ready. You gave the order to open fire, and the flaming volley burst forth with a roar. That's right. Our Olymp Ivanovich does not like to delay, smiled Tursky. And you are watching, and your will. The movements of dozens of people obey your will. The ship maneuvers, rushing into battle. The shells bursting behind us. Here time is counted by the second hand. You'll finish the first volleys of fire. It's about that firing on the shore when we destroyed 3 batteries. Turovsky couldn't stand it again. That's right. The comrades picked up on it. And Ivashenko continued. The command 2 more, and immediately 3 to the right. And the enemy is surrounded by a frame of fire. All salvos are deadly. The enemy is on fire. The polar dawn has begun over the sea. The dawn has risen over distant Moscow, and where Alexandrov is in the purple dawn, your son is sprawled in his crib, as happy children sleep at dawn. The navigator paused, looking around at the quiet sailors with his black eyes. They were waiting for the continuation. And the senior lieutenant, taking a deep breath, raised his voice. For the children's peace exterminate the executioners, no mercy for the fierce enemies. It's not for nothing that the star of burning rays, the star of war, illuminates you. Everyone liked the poem about the commander beloved by the artillerymen. Not sophisticated in poetry, we did not go into their advantages and disadvantages. We were won over by sincerity and excitement of our ship's poet. The navigator received orders. Write poems about the commander of the ship. But the commissar is obligatory. Give us a song about the burden. Good. Good, laughed the senior lieutenant. There will be such poems. And there will definitely be a song about our ship. But we still have not much combat biography, so there is not much to talk about. Comrade senior lieutenant. Afonin squeezed closer to him. Write a song about Gremichny, and we'll all take care of a solid combat biography of the ship. Once, during the shelling of the enemy shore, 2 airplanes appeared in the sky. Signalman Onokov shouted, "Pikerchiki." What type? Gurin stepped to the sailor. It seems, Junkers. The planes flew away from us. By eye I determined the approximate height, about 3,000 meters. Selivanov, wielding a handheld rangefinder, confirmed it. The ship stopped firing, so as not to give itself away by flashes of salvos. But one of the planes still noticed us and turned toward the destroyer. Gremichny was camouflaged, but not quite successfully clear. White and black stripes on the hull and superstructures did not merge with the background of dark rocks of the Arctic Circle. Therefore it is not surprising that we were detected from the air. Anti-aircraft gunners, Tovzia, ordered Captain 3rd Rank Gurin. We quickly dropped anchor and moved to the middle of the bay. The commander wanted to get room to maneuver. The bomber flew at our ship. Rumbling turned to the left. The plane also changed course. There was no doubt he is preparing to attack. Our anti-aircraft gunners opened barrage fire. And then, frozen with binoculars in his hands, Senior Lieutenant Stasenko suddenly shouted, "Shot." That's our plane. Too late. A wall of fire stood in the way of the plane. It bumped into it and went up in smoke. Falling aside, the bomber headed southeast, where our airfield was located. We were stunned. How could this have happened? We had not been warned that new Soviet P-2 airplanes had appeared at the front. They looked like Junkers, 88s from afar. It was no accident that the signalman Onokov made a mistake. The pilot's behavior was also surprising. Why did he need to hunt for our ship? Maybe we were not warned in order to preserve military secrecy. But this time the secret, which was kept from the enemy, failed us. Only after the plane fell aside, Burden took its place at the steep cliff and again opened fire on the location of enemy troops. An entry appeared in the destroyer's watch log. ... The ship's artillery hit our airplane, simulating the enemy's actions. The ship's logbook is a strictly official document. It is not supposed to comment on events in it. But the sailors made these comments on the Ute. It is a pity that they were not heard by the pilot and those who sent new airplanes without informing the crews of the ships. My command is night sightings. They're mounted on the wings of the bridge. They are clever and subtle devices that help you see in the dark. On rare occasions they're used during the day when visibility is poor. Right now, everyone's busy inspecting the machinery. I should have checked the sights too, but I didn't dare to take off the covers from the instruments. The sea is soaring. Frosty fog comes in waves on the bridge. Fluffy frost settles on the metal. And my sightseers are afraid of dampness. Only in the afternoon the fog cleared somewhat. The black ribs of the coastal rock and part of the roadstead were revealed. Onokov and I noticed a submarine. It was going at a slow speed with the barrel of the bow cannon hanging up. A shot rang out. The signalman sat down from surprise. Then he smiled. The Nazi transport had given its soul to God. In his voice you could hear envy for the submariner's luck. It was as if Onokov wanted to say, "Wish we could do the same." A second shot rang out over the harbour. "Look," laughed Selivanov, who was leaning out of the hatch of the rangefinder post. "2 ships are dead. Well done." "We have already gotten used to these shots. Every time the boat returns from the sea, submariners with gunshots inform their friends about the number of sunk enemy ships. Curious sailors came running to the bridge. I had to share binoculars with them, to give them a stereo tube, and Komenko persuaded me to open for him the port side viewer. It was a sin to refuse him. When the boat moored at the pier, Onokov sighed. "Oh, we should go there. To Vardar, to Nordkap." "I think we'll go soon," said Komenko, carefully covering the sighting device with a cover. "We have been ordered to ban the boilers, so we have a long way to go." The boiler driver was right. In the evening, the commissar and agitators went around the battle stations and explained the combat mission received by the ship. Soviet destroyers Gremichny and Loud, together with the British cruiser Kenya, destroyers Bedouin and Intrepid, go out to search for the enemy convoy in the area of Vard Cape Nordkap. The campaign will end with an artillery raid on the Nazi naval fortress Vard. Rattling went out to sea. The snow-covered hills of the native land, barely recognizable in the darkness, remained astern. There was silence on the bridge. Only the wind occasionally flapped the sailcloth dodgers of the bridge. Next to the commander stood his assistant senior Lieutenant Vasiliev. "I would fight with fascist ships," I heard the quiet voice of the senior lieutenant. "That's why we are going, Alexander Mikhailovich," Gurin replied. And the signalman grumbled. "It's dark as in a corked barrel." The night was indeed very black. Nothing could be seen. You can't even make out where the mask platform is. And in such darkness Fokiv managed to find an English cruiser. In the night viewfinder I could barely make out its tall and massive masts. Then the dark humps of gun turrets appeared. Following Kenya out of the darkness floated silhouettes of 2 British destroyers. Narrow-beam lantern cruiser exchanged calls with us. Ships built a keel column and full speed rushed to the enemy's shores. Watching the sea in my sector, I can hardly distinguish the silhouette of the cruiser ahead. Behind it comes the Bedouin. The Rattlesnake follows in third. The Loud is swaying in her keel waters. The line of the squadron closes destroyer Intrepid, all the time climbing out, then to the right, then left unimportant, apparently it steers. We take all measures that the voyage passed secretly. The success of a raiding operation depends entirely on the suddenness of the blow. Smoking and loud talking are forbidden on the upper deck. The boiler operators were strictly instructed to keep out smoke and sparks. The more outrageous it seemed to us when the destroyer Intrepid was coming up behind us. Above it suddenly rose a sheaf of red sparks. Blown by the wind, sparks fanning in different directions, slowly falling into the sea. What is it? Inexperience of boiler machinists or treachery? Signalman Onokov whispers in my ear. "Ah, sons of bitches, what are they doing?" For a while the torch over the chimney of the Intrepid went out, but soon the English destroyer again exhaled a cloud of sparks. Our mood worsened. A frosty, gusty wind blew in. It dispersed the clouds. It became a little brighter. The greenish, shimmering light of the polar lights drew the sky in pale, layered stripes. Our ships were already sailing along the Norwegian coast. What awaited us ahead? We stared into the darkness until our eyes hurt. It became even more difficult to watch the sea when soon the aurora borealis went out in the sky. We could not see the enemy if he lurked on our way. Suddenly Fokiv loudly reported, "I see a ship." What eyes this guy has. Any cat would be jealous. The darkness was pierced by flashes of a signal searchlight, dots and dashes. The fascist patrol trawler was persistently beating out light Morse code. "Do not answer," ordered Gurin. The cruiser did not give itself away either. The squadron passed the enemy patrol. The fascists apparently took us for their own and stopped calling. On the shore, here and there playfully blinked beacons and sights. It means that the enemy camp is calm. Hitlerites are not waiting for an attack. At least one transport met. My partner Nikolai Schwetz said, "The enemy did not attack us, but also did not show up. The ships were still going in keel water formation." Ornukov and I looked warily at the Intrepid. So far it was not sparking, but it was still trotting, constantly getting out of the keel stream of the Loud. Reinforcements came to the bridge. All the sighters, rangefinders and signalmen were looking into the darkness with all their eyes. The cruiser began to turn to the right. The dark, precipitous Cape Nordkap, the northernmost point of Europe, began to recede behind the stern of the Gremichny, and in 2 minutes it was already on our right side. The squadron lay on a reverse course. At full speed the ships went along the gloomy enemy coast. The cruiser confidently led the squadron. At times we came very close to the coastal rocks. Then suddenly the hulk of Kenya turned abruptly into the sea, and the land disappeared from sight. The Nazis must have had mines in these places. So the British perfectly knew the fairways and the minefields. That kind of awareness was enviable. Near Tanna Fjord, a bright square of light flashed ashore. As the rumbling came nearer, I saw a man coming out of a small house built by the water's edge. He had left the door open. "What is this carelessness?" asked our new artilleryman, Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Ivanovich Kleopin, who recently replaced Rudakov. "In my opinion, this is done intentionally," said Senior Political Officer Rozhkov. "Norwegian patriots want to help our ships." The squadron went further south, and the door of the cabin still shone brightly in the night. It was an excellent beacon, and our navigator took advantage of it. The sea was deserted. The sailors were vexed. Soon Varde, and still no enemy convoys not seen. Gurin, looking at the dense figure of the artilleryman, finally spoke. "So we strike at the fortress, coastal batteries and port facilities." "I see, Comrade Commander." At this time, on the signal from Kenya, all the ships made a turn and went to approach the shore. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the polar night still reigned over the sea, from the cruiser rushed to the shore illuminating shells. And then Kenya rattled a salvo of guns of the main caliber. It was a signal to all ships. The flares illuminated the snow-covered shore, the foamy sea, the white surf. Bright strips of light, burning out, fell down, and to replace them in the sky hung more and more chandeliers. "Fire!" simultaneously shouted gun commanders Afonin, Phil, Konyakin and Tursky to their calculations. There was a deafening salvo of all 4 long-range guns of the Gremichny. Their recoil seemed to squeeze the destroyer into the sea, but it again jumped out on a wave, and again at the guns heard. Tuvzia. Fire. The ships were firing at high speed. The waves slammed the deck, rattling, lurching elastically. The commanders' coats were soaked. They became heavy, making it difficult to work. The sailors threw them off. Orange tongues flashed over the islands. It was the enemy coastal battery, opened fire on our ships. With a screech over the Gremichny flew one shell, followed by a second, third. The wall of flames raged where the fascist fortress, port facilities, warehouses, barracks were located. Soon Senior Lieutenant Hlyopin assigned the commanders a new target. It was a coastal battery. It was silenced after a few of our shells. As we learned afterwards, in order to mislead the Nazis and complicate the situation, in the middle of the shelling from the destroyer Intrepid was fired a torpedo in the direction of the islands. Smoke, glowing buoys were also dropped on the water. These simulated a firing ship. On these buoys opened fire on the hitherto silent second enemy battery. Soon a resounding explosion was heard. It split the torpedo, hitting the coastal rocks. The enemy shore was burning brighter and brighter. Explosions, scattering flames, smoke and sparks shook everything around. Soon the second coastal battery was suppressed. The enemy was silent, but our signallers detected several white storms stretching from the shore. Nazi torpedo boats rushed to attack the squadron. We prepared to repel them. In the field of vision of binoculars, mounted on the head of the night viewer, I clearly saw how the boats jumped from wave to wave. However, the Nazis chickened out. Far from reaching the distance of the torpedo salvo, the boats abruptly turned back and quickly melted in the darkness. For 10 minutes of the fire attack, Gremichny fired 100 shells at the enemy. The cruising squadron headed for home shores. Soon we learned about the results of our raid. The squadron destroyed one heavy coastal battery with servants, another battery was damaged, port facilities were destroyed. On the same day, the Commissar read us a curious document. It bore the Vulture Office of Rear Admiral Barrow, commander of the 10th Squadron. November 25, 1941, the document, addressed to the commander of the Soviet destroyer Gremichny, read, "I am very happy to take this convenient opportunity to thank you for your loyal and efficient participation in the joint R operation which took place last night. I have also seen and admired the way in which you held your place in the ranks admirably, and also the way in which you opened fire with your guns as soon as the signal was given by me. I am proud to have had the Soviet ship Gremichny as part of my 10-cruiser squadron." Rear Admiral Barrow. A rare winter storm had broken out. There were no waves in the usual sense. Water mountains rolled over the sea. Mushy, with capes of white foam, they fiercely piled on the ship. The half-bank barely had time to throw off the foamy hill, as a new shaft with a giant force collapsed on the destroyer, plunged it into the abyss. A maelstrom was boiling on the deck, with the entire turret of the first gun hidden in it. Rushing down from the height of the half-bank, the water tore onto the deck, hissing angrily, pounced on the superstructures, smashed against the torpedo apparatus and gun shields. Gremichny squeaked pitifully with all the spars. Alexander Mikhailovich. The commander turned from the bridge's observation glass to his assistant. "Order the crew not to go on the upper deck. The watch on the first and fourth guns, as well as on the torpedo apparatuses, should be removed." Shortly after Vassiliev passed this order from the commander, water appeared in our artilleryman's cabin. It was flowing from the ventilation pipes and had already flooded the deck up to the ankles. When the ship rolled, the water overflowed from side to side, soundly slapping against the lockers. Petty Officer Selivanov determined. The fungi had been torn off. He reported the incident by phone to the bridge. "Stop the water supply," Vassiliev ordered him. "Just do it together." Selivanov hung up the phone and looked at the resting sailors. The rocking was shaking them fiercely, but the men, strapped to their bunks, slept. Fatigue had taken its toll. Whom to choose puzzled the petty officer. He was sorry to disturb his comrades, but it was impossible to go alone. His glance fell on a stout looker, Sailor Petukov. He was sleeping in an unbuttoned half-coat. Instead of a pillow, he put a Nushanka hat under his head. With his left foot, the sailor was resting on the puller driver. His face was greasily glossy. He had not washed his face for the third day. Before the voyage, the foreman of the rangefinders and the sightseer had quarrelled. Selivanov, checking the cleaning in the cabin, saw that the copper bars, which were used to fix the linoleum to the deck, were badly worn. He made Petukov clean them again with brick dust. The sailor did the work reluctantly, and when the petty officer went out of the door, he heard the words "picky." For a coppersmith is ready to kill a man. Petukov hated cleaning coppers, like all of us. It's tedious and stultifying work, but as a pity, Petukov had to do it more often than other sailors. On this ground, he developed a dislike for Selivanov, who liked glamour and glitter. Thus, their diplomatic relations were very strained. "I'll wake Petukov," decided Selivanov. "He will not be on watch for a while yet. He will have time to dry off and rest." Having learned what was required of him, the lookout immediately hurried away. He was fond of any disaster. Having tied themselves with a strong hemp rope, Selivanov and Petukov went under the half-bank cut and lurked, waiting for the wave to subside. They held an old sailcloth shirt in their hands. There was nothing else to plug the cursed holes. The sea hummed and groaned. The wind whistled over the upper deck. It was scary and creepy. "Run," shouted Selivanov. The sailors in 2 jumps flew up the gangway and found themselves on the half-bank face-to-face with an ominous wall of water that rose from overboard. The petty officer sharply pulled Petukov by the arm and dragged him into the passage between the radio rooms. Looking back, the sailor was horrified the wave was bending the copper rails of the trawl and the windlasses like thin rods. As soon as the 9th shaft came down, the sailors rushed forward. It was close to the mushrooms. The farthest of them was at the hatch of the paint shop, and the closest not far from the shield of the first gun. But neither Selivanov nor Petukov managed to approach them at once. A huge shaft covered the half-bank with a shaggy cap. The lookout managed to sneak under the gun shield. The petty officer hesitated at the superstructure and got into the maelstrom. He was knocked off his feet and rolled across the deck. Ice-cold water rushed into his mouth, eyes, ears, by the scruff of his neck, into the sleeves of his coat. Selivanov could neither open his eyes nor scream. The only thing he did was to spread his arms, trying to catch his fingers on something. As soon as he had grasped the banquet of the fire hose, tearing off his nails to the point of blood, he was torn off together with the banquet and thrown aside. The petty officer was horrified to feel that his feet had lost their footing and were hanging over the gushing abyss. Already at the last moment he clung with a dead grip to the bent leering pole. And only now Selivanov felt a dull pain in his lower back. It was Petukov, noticing that the petty officer was in danger, pulled him with a cable to himself under the gun shield. "Hold on." Selivanov heard the sailor's exclamation when the wave came off the half-bank. The sailor pulled the petty officer out of the abyss and thus saved him from certain death. When Selivanov was out of breath, Petukov shouted to him, "Guard me, I'm going." The petty officer protested and raised his hand. "Only the two of us." Having waited for a convenient moment, the sailors rushed to the ventilation pipes. The caps of the ventilating fungi were in place. They were just rocked, weakened by the wave's blows. Having tightened the metal lid of the first fungus, Selivanov and Petukov rushed to the shield. When the shaft rumbled further, and the next one only rose above the bow, squinting at the destroyer with an ominous mane-like crest, the sailors jumped to the other caps. Again, they had no time to finish their work. They had to hide from another wave. At last the mushrooms were wrapped up. Selivanov and Petukov, wet to the skin, had hardly bounced back to the cannon as the sea again violently broke into the half-bank. It tore the sailcloth from the gun shield, flooded the gunners' seats, which were held by two brave men. The churning water tore the sailors' feet from the deck. For a moment both hung in a horizontal position, holding on with only their arms. But then the wave broke. The petty officer and the sailor heard a shout. "Receive." That from the bridge of the second, upper gun, petty officer Konyakin, gunners Yusin and Krapov gave Selivanov and Petukov a hemp rope. "Go first," suggested to the sailor the petty officer. "No, you. Stop talking." Soon both daredevils, picked up by the strong hands of their friends, found themselves at the navigator's cabin. From here it was easier to go down to the rosters and sneak under the half-bank cut. When Selivanov and Petukov went down into the cockpit, it was already dry. The sailors pumped out the water. The deck was wiped clean. Tied to the board with a sailcloth strap, it was the only way to rest. Then the commander of anti-aircraft machine gun Viktor Slepov spoke. "I must assume that you were born for the second time." Petukov had blood streaming down his face, a prune of bruises swelling under his eyes. Selivanov's fingernails were bleeding, his bruised ribs ached. Looking at each other, the petty officer and the sailor smiled. Selivanov extended his hand, and Petukov shook it silently but firmly. Old grudges were forgotten. Forever. "Friends," Slepov spoke again, unbuckling his belt, "I wouldn't mind having a snack now. There are boiled potatoes in the galley." "Lovely." Kornilov cooked it after the pot of porridge overturned and almost scolded him. "Salted cabbage and herring I've already saved." "As much black bread as you want." "Eh?" He sat down on the bunkhouse and threw up his arms to hold on to the frame of the upper bunk when the ship tilted sharply. Three men raised their heads, expressing their readiness to keep the machine gunner company. Only Selivanov began to dissuade him. "Don't go, Vitya. You can't see God's light there." Nonsense. It's not half a tank, I'll be through in no time. Balancing on the swaying deck, Slepov took out a green enamelled cistern from the locker painted as oak. I'm off, he said, tipping his hat up to his eyebrows. A few minutes passed after the gunner had gone up to the upper deck, and then he reappeared in the cockpit, but without his hat and without the pot. His usually girlishly ruddy face was whiter than chalk this time. The water was dripping off the petty officer, and Victor, like a fish, was groping for air with his mouth wide open, as if he had nothing to breathe. When Slepov regained consciousness, he confusedly told us what had happened to him. As soon as the petty officer stepped out under the rostrum, a wave came like a fluff ball, lifted him above the deck, hit him against the boiler shroud and carried him overboard. For a moment, high above him, the sailor saw the broad trumpet of his native destroyer and the shadow of a man who threw from the bridge a life-preserver, but the circle was swept away. Goodbye, Gremichny flashed through Victor's mind. He knew perfectly well that in such a storm it was hopeless to save a drowning man. If his comrades managed to find him, it would be impossible to lift him to the deck. The wave would smash him against the steel side of the ship. But then a miracle happened. Desperate sailor suddenly picked up by a second wave, like a toy, turned from back to stomach and through. Onto the ship. As if feeling sorry for the horror he had experienced, the wave, already exhausted, gently laid him on the deck. The gunner instinctively grabbed the rails of the mine track. Now nothing could tear him away from this reliable support. Victor. Jumped to him the sailors who had been smoking in the wash basin. Alive. The sailors barely pulled the petty officer off the rail. They managed to do it by forcibly unbending each of his fingers. It's you, Vitya, who's really been born a second time. Pavel Petukov laughed. Now you'll live a long time, Tula. And listen to the commander's orders, added Selivanov. It was said don't go on the upper deck. And I, brothers, didn't hear it, I was asleep. Slepov replied, pouring water out of his coat pockets. The hurricane was still rumbling over the Gremichny. The sailors suffering from appetite were consoled with black bread and sauerkraut. There were 7 of us. We ate leisurely and thoroughly. Biting one by one a piece of bread that passed from hand to hand, the sailors smiled blissfully. They sat on the deck at a table whose legs had been cut off, and which rose only 15 centimeters from the floor. The sides of the ship groaned and creaked with the sound of the waves, and we were calmly munching on our unpretentious food. None of us was discouraged. The situation was the most familiar. Every now and then a gull would crack a joke of some wit, which Gremichny never lacked. My namesake, Selivanov turned to Tursky. Tell me how your grandmother at the age of 92 had all her teeth intact. Did she drink kumis, pine infusion, or vodka? Tursky chuckled with his mouth full of cabbage and waved his hand. Shut up, Selivanov. But we were already laughing, having remembered the commander's blunder. Once, in the heat of irrepressible harassment on the Ute, he composed an incredible story of his family tree, in which his Kazam grandmother played not the last role. From this pedigree it followed that he, Michael Tursky, if not a descendant of Genghis Khan, then certainly Battier. Suddenly the destroyer sharply fell on board. My comrades, scattered as they were pinned to the lockers. Wiping his face blackened with mud, Selivanov was the first to rise and philosophically calmly said, I don't remember which of the wise men said that people are of 3 kinds: those who are alive, those who are dead, and those who swim on the sea. So you're saying that we're, not quite of this world? Tursky shook his head with a light crest. I look at my friends and consider the meaning of what they say. The rocking does not take me, so my head is clear. Of course, a sailor is an ordinary man. But sometimes he thinks a lot. I know that from myself. And these thoughts are different. At my 20s, I can't help but think of my favourite girl. Who among the sailors doesn't have one? We lived next door to each other. We met often. She used to say, I'll be with you for life. But not a year and a half after I left for the Navy on a Komsomol ticket, she married an oil engineer. Apparently, she thought this man was more reliable. It still hurts. You chase away the thoughts of a treacherous girl, but they keep popping into your head. That's the way a man is. But in a storm, you don't think of the bad. You think about the best about your friends, simple and brave guys, who in difficult moments open their wide soul, and you see with your own eyes all its richness and beauty. Here we are sitting and chatting peacefully, forgetting that there is a snow blizzard overboard, an icy desert of the sea, and there is no one around for hundreds of miles except the enemy. I listen to my comrades' jokes, salty sea words. And I'm at ease, and my thoughts are hovering in my head. My thoughts. There's no anchor for you, no barriers. Years will pass, the war will be over. We'll all return home, to our favourite work if we're still alive. With what pleasure I would be now to the locksmith's workbench, to feel the exciting smell of metal filings, slightly burnt and oiled. There will be difficulties, of course, but they're nothing compared to what we're going through now. And when I'll be unbearable, I'll remember this angry storm, and this warm cabin, and this meal, when there is nothing in the world tastier than black bread and sauerkraut. Sailors know it very well, especially the northern ones. I will remember the wandering smile on the face of Selivanov, who never gets discouraged, the bony, slightly confused face of Tursky, the quick, marvellously handsome Mostetsov, the thin, slightly sullen Yusin, and many other friends. It is difficult now, but they are not discouraged. They chew, laugh, as if Gremichny is not somewhere beyond the 73rd parallel, as if at this hour there is nothing more important in the world than bread and cabbage. "So who are we?" came a hoarse voice from the deckhouse. Selivanov turned around. "Panya, why don't you put a kitty on your neck?" Instead of answering the question, the rangefinder stretched out. This referred to the young machine gunner Pimenov. In the first campaign, the sailor was so beaten by seasickness that the poor man would not leave the bucket. During one attack of nausea, he bent over sharply. The upraised shackle caught his neck, and Pinya could not understand for a long time why the stinking garbage bucket stuck to him. Now Pimenov wiped his eyes, unbuckled his sailcloth bunk strap, and stepped toward us. He dexterously intercepted a loaf of bread halfway between me and Tursky and sank his strong and broad teeth into it. His pink, wide-skinned face expressed bliss. "At least you washed your hands." Tursky looked up at him with grey eyes. "There's no fresh water," Pimenov replied obediently. "But my hands will make your dishes greasier. It's not dirt on them, but gun oil. I was cleaning the machine gun." "Brothers," Selivanov shouted jokingly, "stock up on breadcrumbs. We're all going to have an upset stomach. Come on, Pinya, give me a bun. I'm not afraid. My stomach can digest an anchor." But when Pimenov, that young but shrewd sailor, took out of the pocket of his shiny cotton pants a delicacy acquired by some unknown means, a large head of onion, Tursky was the first to declare, "Take a share." "But my hands are dirty." "Nothing. That dirt is noble, fighting. It is rich in vitamins." Piny's question was forgotten. Pimenov divided the bulb equally to everyone. Laughing, all of us, to the horror of our seasick buddies, purposely chomped loudly, praising cabbage and onions. And those, lying on the bunks and tillers, could hardly restrain their inordinate desire to rush upstairs to the wash basin. We squatted around the table with the legs cut off, each of us with our own fingers and our own appetites. Onions seem incredibly juicy and delicious. The name Pinya stuck to Pimenov by accident. Once he imaginatively and vividly played a scene from the movie Seekers of Happiness, and so skillfully copied the postures and gestures of the artist who played the role of Pini, that since then the sailor Pimenov otherwise, and not called as only Pinya the King of Suspenders. And he liked this Pinya even more than his real name, which sounded somewhat archaic, Luke. The jokes and laughter were interrupted by the hissing of a speaker mounted in a corner of the cockpit. The sailors strained their ears. Comrades Red Fleet and petty officers. Artillerymen recognized the hoarse voice of the commander of the ship in the wind. We fell silent. Your friends in the engine and boiler rooms, at the guns and on the bridge, due to the hurricane, stood 2 shifts. They are tired and hungry. They must be changed. I warn you, it's risky. I ask the most confident in their strength, and first of all the communists, to take the watch. It was an unusual request, the first since the day of the flag raising on the Gremichny. Selivanov reached for his half-coat. Tursky rose to his full mast height and asked, "Friends, please give me dry mittens." Selivanov was a party candidate, and Tursky was non-partisan. Both of them silently stepped behind the Cummings the high threshold of the cubicle. Soon the sound of their footsteps was swallowed up by the rumble of the sea. From the neighbouring cabin, where the boiler machinists and bilge operators lived, a few people also went up to the upper deck, under the cut of the half-bank. "Wait." Looking around, Petukov said, "Why were we, the Komsomol members, bypassed by the commander? Come on, brothers, who considers himself a real Soviet sailor and not a wet hen." He began to stir up his sleeping comrades. They did not immediately understand what was going on, but when the meaning of Petukov's words reached them, they hurried up and began to dress on the move. "And I'm with you," exclaimed Pimenov. "I am not a passenger." He tore himself away from the bulkhead and with a foxtrot step walked to the hangar. "So you, Pinya, are not a Komsomol member," Petukov interjected. "You weren't invited either, but you're going, aren't you?" Pimenov squinted angrily with whitish lashes. "And why am I worse than you? Perhaps I have a purer soul than you." At another time Petukov would have cut him to pieces with his witticisms, but now, nodding his blonde head, he calmly apologized. "I'm sorry, my friend, I just didn't think of that." "That's right," Pinya retorted, clapping the palm of his hand on his ear flap. Both of them, swaying like drunks, grasped with their hands the tubular pillars that came in their way, and with difficulty won back every step forward. "What a thrashing," Cockney bellowed. "It's been a long time since I've seen such a thing." It was dark on the upper deck. The sailors were caught in a damp wind. From the half-bank a stream was rushing down the gangways. It did not stop, but only weakened for a moment. At such a moment the sailors, cat-like, jumped on the gangway leading to the half-bank, and then immediately rushed behind the superstructure. Several times they were caught in the whirlpool. The sailors supported each other, grasping the leer with their hands. When they were at the range tower, Selivanov approached the artillery commander, Senior Lieutenant Kleopin, and reported, "The calculation of post number 1 is ready for battle." So the battle alarm was not played on the ship. Was surprised by the artilleryman. Why such a report? But similar reports were already coming to the main command post and from other battle stations, from torpedo apparatuses, from the main caliber guns from the mine station, or, as it was otherwise called, the bombing post, from the engine and boiler rooms, from the emergency parties. Leaning toward Kyopin, senior political officer Rozhkov shouted in his ear, "Anatoly Ivanovich, understand and evaluate what has happened. Our Komsomol members are following the communists, and after those non-party. So it turned out that our whole team was at their posts, as if on red alert." "I recognize the rattlesnake," exclaimed Hlupine. "It was not for nothing that I asked to be on it." Realizing what had happened, Captain Third-Rank Gurin, usually reserved and taciturn, said excitedly, "Wonderful people we have. It is a sin not to like such sailors." "What can I say?" said Vassiliev. "Our sailors are the right people." Rattling, tossed by the furious sea, was making its way forward through the hurricane. In the twilight of dawn, Selivanov and Petukov in the night sights first detected the silhouettes of unknown ships. Their reports were confirmed by signallers Onokov and Lisnev. This time a real battle alarm was sounded on the ship. Silhouettes turned out to be convoy ships. Gremichny soon joined the caravan of ships and joined its guard. The communists were the last to leave their battle stations. And not all of them, but only those whose shift was going to rest. In the evening of March 28, 1942, the Soviet destroyers Gremichny and Sokroshitelny, the British destroyer Orby, and 4 minesweepers went out to meet the convoy, which was coming from Reykjavik. The commander acquainted the sailors with the situation. The caravan of ships we were to meet was somewhere southeast of Medveji Island. Or rather, not the caravan, but its remnants back in the Norwegian Sea. The ships were discovered and attacked by Nazi planes and submarines. And the Allies, instead of strengthening the escort, recalled some of the warships back to England, leaving the transports to their fate. Clouds of sticky snow were passing over the windy sea. Soviet ships hurried to rescue the helpless caravan. Every minute was precious. The fate of the ships depended on it. And what does the cargo of one transport mean? It is 10 railroad echelons with food, industrial equipment. During the first night of the campaign, we had 5 battle alarms. During one of them, Gremichny attacked a detected enemy submarine. We heard an extra underwater explosion, but there was no time to clarify what caused it. And in the darkness, we could not see any traces of the attack. We assumed that the battery on the boat exploded. Our minesman, petty officer of the 2nd Article Osipov, and sailor Panchenko, who were dropping large depth bombs on the boat, did a good job. We were in a hurry. It became known that the fascists sank another transport from the convoy. There was no limit to our indignation. It is surprising how Hitlerites easily manage to win, while the ships go from England and Iceland to the meeting point with Soviet ships. And why, after our destroyers enter the guard, not a single ship is lost. All this happens because every Soviet sailor clearly understands the main thing: the cargo, which is carried by transports, is needed by our fathers and brothers, needed by the people fighting for the freedom and honor of the motherland. So we took care of these transports more than our eyes. Those who send convoys to us look at the matter differently. The ships belong to private companies, and they are well insured. These companies, which send any old Transportishki to Russia, even benefit if the enemy sinks these ships, then they can get generous insurance money for them. There is another reason. For us, every convoy sailor, regardless of his nationality, is an ally in our sacred struggle. We treat British sailors as battle buddies and are ready to take any risk to help them. And we cannot understand how it is that their own countrymen, sailors of British warships, can abandon transports at the first threat of enemy attack. Different views on life, on battle friendship, on military duty. It was dawning when Petty Officer Nikolai Fokiv, who was standing with me in the same shift on watch, came up to me with his face flushed from the frosty wind and said, "Let's compete who will find the caravan faster." Agreed. I was amused. I have a reliable device, a night sighting device, and the signalman has only binoculars. I have the advantage. But it's not easy for either of us. The sharp, cold wind makes my eyes water, which makes objects double, lose their real outlines. Twisted snow from the clouds overhanging the mast spikes over the collar of my coat. Fokiv watches the sea and the air from the starboard side, and I from the port side. He was more lucky he was the first to spot an enemy air scout, which appeared above the horizon as soon as the sky cleared of clouds. I was annoyed the viewfinder didn't help either. Actually, there was no reason to be offended the plane was on the starboard side, and Fokiv should have noticed it earlier. Soon, as it often happens in the Barents Sea, black clouds began to thicken again in the northwest. They so covered the horizon that they completely hid its outlines. In such an unsightly situation, my sighting device helped me, though the ship was chattering quite a lot on a steep wave and I had to use the handles of the device vigorously, as sailors say, to choose the role. Against the background of black clouds, I saw an alien spot. The edges of the clouds were jagged, scraggly, but this thick cloud had curved edges, and it floated much faster than the clouds hanging over the sea. A cap of smoke. Right on the nose, I reported. What's that? Fascist or Allied ships? In any case, it was still a long way from the intended rendezvous point. The flagship ordered to go forward in front formation. Soon the semaphore came: when we meet the enemy, we will attack. Prepare to attack torpedo apparatus and smoke equipment. Sailors took up their battle alert posts. Gremichny and Sokroshitelny, having added a turn, lay down a course on a smoke of an unknown ship. But a thick snow charge covered both the sky and the sea around. We can barely see the grey outlines of our flagship, coming not far from us. In such conditions, it is possible to miss the enemy and slip past him. All of us signallers, spotters and rangefinders were groping the greying sea with the pupils of optical instruments, binoculars, stereo tubes, spotters and rangefinders. Suddenly, in the gap between two strips of snow charge, I noticed a motley silhouette of a large warship. I immediately reported it to the commander. Gurin, as a youth, quickly jumped to the railings of the left wing of the bridge and stared into the snow veil. Senior Lieutenant Lyopin gave the command to load the guns. Our new destroyer, Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Korotkovich, ordered to aim the torpedo apparatuses at the target. The torpedo firing machine had already generated the necessary data. Everything was ready for battle. We were waiting for Gurin's command. Fullest, he ordered, having received a signal from the flagship. The sea was noisily pushing back. Our destroyers, as if on wings, flew forward. The bow of the Rattle raised. The storm behind the stern became higher and whiter. Stand down. Anton Iosifovich suddenly collapsed. Shot. Guns and torpedo tubes shot. Gurin this time almost said the usual phrase guns and torpedo tubes to zero, but he realized in time. The thing is that in the campaigns for better readiness to open fire, our bow guns were turned to one side, about 45 degrees, and aft on the other. The torpedo tubes were in the same position. Everything on the Gremichny had been thought out and provided for in advance. The commander's order became clear to me sooner than to others. From behind the snow veil crawled English cruiser Trinidad with gun barrels pointed at us. Behind her, the destroyer Fury came into view. Allies. With them, the destroyers Rattle and Crushing and Orby exchanged identifications. This occurred at 6 hours and 21 minutes on March 29th, 1942. 3.5 hours later, our destroyers approached the convoy without interference. It consisted of 1 destroyer, 7 transports and 2 minesweepers. The Soviet ships took their place in the marching guard. The crew of the Orby Warby was ordered to search for the rest of the transports scattered in the Barents Sea. Ivan Svarin, foreman of deck commanders, came up to the bridge. He reported to the commander of the combat unit that everything was in order at the guns, and sighed. The guns will now have to unload in the base. Don't be in a hurry. Senior Lieutenant Kayapin calmed him down. The campaign was not over yet. At 11 o'clock, a thick snow charge was flying over the lumpy sea. The twilight of the polar day faded even more. The charge swiftly drifted away to give way to another equally dense curtain. At times the visibility improved, but it did not exceed 10 to 15 cable feet. As we sailed through the snow, we heard rumbling explosions coming from the port side of the transports. On the Gremichny and Sokrushitelny, the battle alarm was played. Nothing could be seen from the bridge of our ship, yet there was an impenetrable snow wall from the sea to the clouds. Then the explosions began to move to the right, rumbled ahead on the course of the burden. What was going on there? Finally, Gurin received a message that the British cruiser Trinidad is fighting with 3 Nazi destroyers. By this time, the snow veil under the pressure of the wind broke, and, driven to the southwest, hastily picked up its foggy hem. Tearing wisps of cloud with her masts, an English destroyer sprang out of the charge. It was the Fury. Bursts of bursts grew at its low sides. He rushed away, coming in astern of us. What's the matter with him? I asked Fokiv. Where is he running away from the caravan? Instead of answering me, Fokiv suddenly shouted excitedly. Splashes. On the port side of the crucible. Indeed, in 10 to 13 meters from our flagship burst shells, raising fountains of spray. By their number, we realized at once that they were firing from a 5-gun ship. The shells fell then close to the Crushing, then far away. Several bursts rose ahead and a little to the right of the burden. The flagship signaled to us, increased the course to full. Both Soviet destroyers rushed to the explosions. At 11:22 a.m., on the course 50 degrees of the left side of the Gremichny, among the torn wisps of snow cloud, showed a predatory silhouette of one of our old acquaintances, the German destroyer-type Reader. Crushing he opened earlier, and his gunners from a distance of 15 cable meters opened fire. The first salvo flight, the second, third, fourth salvos rumbled over the sea. The last of them merged with the salvo of the guns of the Gremichny. This commander's Svarin discharged cannons on the Nazi destroyer. Over the sea rolled unceasing thunder. The water was boiling around. Our ship was lurching sharply. Cover. Fokiv burst out. The shells of the Soviet ships hit the middle of the rudder. Some debris flew up. A cloud of vapor rose above the Nazi ship. A hit in the engine room. But the enemy was lucky. When he turned sharply to the right, a snow vortex instantly closed in on him, spinning, Redder fled, taking advantage of it. The battle was short-lived. Enemy destroyer in a short battle managed to give the Soviet ships 5 volleys. Our destroyers hit it with 7 artillery salvos. An hour and a half later, we found the cruiser Trinidad accompanied by the destroyer Fury. The cruiser went with a roll on the port side. There was a huge gaping hole under her bridge. Smoke was billowing from it, and soon flames erupted there. It turned out that Trinidad was torpedoed at 11:27 a.m. 2 enemy destroyers, which took advantage of the protracted snow charge and broke through to the caravan in the zone of protection minesweepers. While searching for transports, the raiders ran into a cruiser and attacked it. One of their torpedoes hit the hull between the bridge and the trumpet Trinidad. As a result, the cruiser flooded the boiler room. There were wounded. Cruiser artillery fire sank 1 German destroyer and severely damaged another. The third ran into our ships. At 13 hours 10 minutes, the cruiser and 2 British destroyers broke away from the convoy, heading for Kola Bay. In guarding the transports remained Gremichny, Sokrushitelny, and 2 British minesweepers. Not much. The convoy was approaching the Murmansk coast. The land was not visible because of the snow veil. The ships were on the counting track. In the afternoon on Gremichny was received a message that on the way of the convoy to the Kola Bay the enemy had placed up to 5 submarines. Floating mines were noticed. In order to protect the transports from torpedoes and mines, our flagship decided to take the convoy into the ice area. Whole ice fields and individual small icebergs stretched nearby. Gremichny, covering the ships from the west, was the last to approach the ice edge. Gurin carefully searched out the wide divots. To our delight, our commander turned out to be an excellent expert in ice navigation, although before this case we had avoided entering them. Necessary precautions were taken on the ship. A watch was set up to monitor the condition of the hull, watertight bulkheads were closed, and water-draining means were put in readiness. All this was in case of possible breaches. Rattling cautiously approached the ice edge, pushed the bow into the thinnest place. By this maneuver the commander saved the ship's cheekbones from hitting the ice floes. A tailwind was blowing. The rarefied area was soon passed. The rocking decreased. The destroyer hit the heavily compacted ice. The steel hull of the ship rumbled, pushing against the ice floes, trembled and sometimes even seemed to be raised when the floating blocks did not retreat. There was such a deafening noise in the cabins and on the upper deck that one could not hear the voice of a man standing nearby. We explained ourselves by signs. We feared most of all for the propellers. If an ice floe got under their blades, we would be stuck. Sometimes on the ice floes we could see the motionless carcasses of fat and lazy seals. One by one, and whole herds of them inhabited these floating islands. Here are dozens of them sleeping on the ice floe, which turned out to be on the way of the Gremichny. When the bow of our ship pushed it hard, the seals stirred, raising their angry faces. Each of them had the look of an old man who was sleepless and suddenly awakened. Most interesting animals and cute. With such a short course, our ship was not steering well. Igor Pichelin had to move his pen to the extreme position. And still it didn't help. Then, by order from the bridge, the machinist started the machines in reverse. One turbine worked forward, the other backward. Pichelin shouted over the ear of the helmsman ship commander, "Do not forget to check the consistency of the rudder and rudder pointers. Ice can push on the rudder feather." Gurin guided the ship along the divorces. Rattling swiveled from right to left without losing sight of the transports. The ships, having found themselves in the ice in safety from the impact of submarines, cheerfully smoked. "Are we not far from them?" Vasiliev asked Gurin. "It's all right. We have some freedom of maneuver. And then a long way on clear water is always less than a short way in the ice." The rumbling continued. Eventually we got used to it. It no longer made us flinch at every deafening crack of ice. With the onset of darkness, rattling and shattering came into clear water. The whole caravan followed them. The warships again took their places in the marching order. The convoy kept the course to the Kola Bay, to Murmansk. March 31st was a usual blizzard day. The wind was getting stronger, howling louder and louder in the gear. The sea was foaming in long strips, the crests of waves were breaking into dust. The storm reached 8 points. Rattling was lurching sharply. It is difficult to stay on your feet. On the bridge is cold and uncomfortable. Toward evening, the flat top of the grey island of Kildin appeared from behind the horizon. The Rybaki Peninsula pressed against the water on the right. Ships and vessels were coming out to the Kildin spit. The flagship ordered the Gremichny to cover the caravan from the sea. The ships slowly, one by one, began to pull into the narrow throat of the Kola Bay. The last one was the largest and heaviest steamship with 4 massive masts and cargo booms. We scolded its captain for his slowness. Ahead of us waited the base well-deserved rest, warmth, hot dinner, and we had to change tack behind the stern of the transport to protect it from the enemy's attack. So in manoeuvring almost on one place passed about 30 minutes. The sky cleared a little, but behind the stern of our ship still flew whitish plumes of snow charge. The faces of the signalmen became grimy and cracked, and their eyes were watering. The commander of the ship stood next to the helmsman and looked forward. He had not slept for several days, almost continuously on the bridge. Suddenly a report came from the anti-aircraft battery. Airplane. It was strange to us that the enemy dared to fly here in such weather. This airplane was huddled on the right, the most rocky shore. We all paid attention to it, although it did not approach the ships. Gurin grudgingly pulled us back. Everyone to fulfill only their duties. This meant that the airplane let them deal with anti-aircraft gunners and other sailors what they should. It was said very conveniently. The huge wave crumbled, breaking into 2 shafts, and in the gap between them showed the humpbacked deckhouse of a German submarine with a periscope stretched upward. She was coming out to attack the last transport. It was so unexpected and unbelievable near our shore that Fokiv, forgetting the rules of the report, simply poked in the direction of the enemy ship with his hand and shouted, "Submarine!" The next moment the submarine was seen and Gurin. She was quite near. Its wet deckhouse flashed for a few seconds and then disappeared again in the waves. Now it became clear to all of us for what purpose here loomed enemy aircraft. His task was to distract the attention of our observers and thus ensure the success of the torpedo attack submarine. Cunning enemy. It happened at 19 hours and 15 minutes. Bombs, Tovs, ordered Gurin and sharply turned the handles of machine telegraphs to full ahead. The siren of the Gremichny howled terribly. It became clear to us on the bridge that the commander intended to ram the underwater pirate. The ship tensed its muscles and leapt forward. At the moment when the bow of the Gremichny was above the place where the boat was detected, a sudden water swell raised its bow, and the ram failed. Boiler machinists, turbinists and navigational electricians, who were in the compartments below the waterline, heard only a scraping under the ship. The keel of the destroyer slid on the submarine. Gurin and navigator accurately detected its location. Miner Peter Osipov, with a blackened face in the cold, on which shone only teeth and clear eyes, long ago stood at the bomb throwers. The destroyer crashed into the waves. The storm behind the stern was boiling more and more strongly. The stern was shaking and tossing upwards. Black cylinders of depth bombs lay in a huge magazine rack. Good thought the miner that the ice from the bombs had been chipped off in advance. He looked around. Icicles of ice were hanging from the sides, from the ladders, from the nets at the shell catching machine. But the metal of the bombs and mountings was clean. Osipov crawled along the rack. The stormy blows of the sea were not terrible to the bombs. In addition to the usual fastenings, they were intercepted by reliable chains, which now had to be given up. High waves crashed over the ute, dousing the mineral from head to toe. The coat and felt boots became heavy in an instant. Osipov, having dropped fur mittens, began to free the bombs from the chains. This work took a few seconds. "Start bombing," followed Gurin's command. The destroyer was passing over the place where the boat was sinking. Osipov rushed to the small bombs located near the board. The incoming wave almost washed away the sailor. He managed to grab the Lear with his hand, and with the other hand to throw overboard the black cylinder of the bomb. The foreman of the torpedoers shouldered Ivanov with a group of sailors rushed to Osipov's aid. "Throw small bombs and we big," shouted Ivanov. Over the stern rose a shaggy stack of water. A rumbling sound swept over the sea. The bombs burst one after another at regular intervals. The frequent explosions seemed to turn the sea inside out. Rumbling reversed course and crashed at full speed into a gigantic water shaft. The curved blade of the bow stabbed into it like butter, and the half-bank disappeared into the water. The wave rolled up to the height of the bridge. The sight glasses of the main command post shattered with a clang. The water vortex swirled all those who stood on the bridge. Igor Pishelin wedged between the pedestal of the steering manipulator and the compass noctusum, and only thus stood. The helmsman was anxiously watching the commander. He wanted to help him, but could not be distracted from the ship's control. In vain worried helmsman he was not the only one who took care of the commander. Signalman Fokiv and rangefinder Gritsai were next to the captain of the third rank, supported him. Gurin was again at the machine telegraphs, calm, concentrated. On the youth Osipov Ivanov, sailors of Afonin's calculation had time to cling to the railings, to the shield of the cannon. The shaft rumbled through the ship and fell into the sea. Gremichny broke out of his embrace, and again depth bombs were bursting behind the stern of the ship. We stopped the submarine attack after the 21st bomb. After the deafening explosions there was an unnatural silence. We were all slightly deafened. Water streamed down from the deck. Foaming waves were passing over the sides. On one of them we saw a scrap of paper, a piece of wood, and a sailcloth bag. Throwing it all away for a moment as material evidence of our battle luck, the Barents Sea swallowed up its spoils again. Now forever. A little away from us, a large oil slick was blurring, with bubbles swirling in its centre. Here, off the island of Kildin, another fascist pirate found his end. "We have opened the account and fascist ships," Osipov said with satisfaction. The transport saved by us was already smoking near the island of Salny. Gremichny headed after him. The ship sounded the battle alarm. Only after that it became known that during the attack the bow emergency party had to work a lot. When the Gremichny was hit by a huge shaft, the foreman of the emergency party, Ustinov, with a group of sailors was in the second cockpit. They heard the cracking of the inner plating of the boards. On the bending pile drivers the paint was bouncing off like glass. Under the incredible pressure of the water, the hull of the ship began to give way. Chumachenko. Suprun. Ordered Chief Petty Officer Ustinov. Put additional supports. Sailors picked up the pre-deployed bars, put them upright, and wooden hammers muscles hammered wedges. Pillars stopped bending. Thanks to Ustinov-Stinov's and his sailors' swagger, great destruction of the ship was prevented. But the Chief Petty Officer did not calm down. He ordered, "Bulin, inspect the chain box." Soon Bulin's round, ball-like, ruffled head appeared in the hatch. He anxiously reported, "Comrade Chief Petty Officer, there's water." Ustinov rushed to the first compartment, and from there to the chain box. In the compartment ominously splashed murky water, arriving before his eyes. How on earth did it get here, thought Ustinov, and looked up from where the cold streams were pouring. It became clear that the pressure of the wave tore off the covers from the fair leads, the holes through which the anchor chains pass. The covers were put back in place, the pump was started, and the water quickly diminished. This did not affect the attack of the submarine, which at that moment was conducted by our ship. The sailors of the emergency party did their duty. In the wardroom especially were the marks of the pressure experienced by the half-bank. Almost all the pillars here were bent. Their pipes now looked like twisted trunks of birch trees with peeled bark. We had never had a more difficult and complicated trip. But navigator Ivashenko judiciously said, "The war is not over yet. There may be more difficult trials." Well, of course not without poems. In the evening the navigator read us his new poems about the courage of sailors, about people who are not afraid of neither the enemy nor the storm, because there is nothing in the world stronger than battle friendship, maritime brotherhood. We listened with admiration and pride. After all, it is about us that the inspired lines sound. The poems were good, but we were only picking on one thing in them, the word brigade. Where did it come from? Fokiv couldn't stand it. Comrade Senior Lieutenant, you have a small inaccuracy. There is no destroyer brigade in the Northern Fleet. Or did you put that in for rhyme? Shut up, Nikolai Afonin shouted at him. No, it will be. That's for sure. Afonin was supported by the sailors. At that time we did not know that a division of destroyers headed by the leader of the Baku would come to us from the Pacific Ocean. After their arrival in the fleet was created a brigade of destroyers. Not knowing how to please the navigator, we gave him a dozen kisets. In this moment of mental exhilaration we forgot that our poet can't even tolerate the smell of makarokny. The senior lieutenant did not want to offend us by his refusal. He rolled a neat cigar from a scrap of newspaper. In the heat of conversation we didn't notice that the cigar was still intact and flew unlit into the water cutoff. I was asked to design the next issue of the ship's wall newspaper Zalp. I had hardly written in large letters our combat gifts to the motherland and rounded the point under the peg of the exclamation mark when I heard the bells of the loud battle. Prepare the ship for battle and march. A long, familiar command. But every time I hear it I get a special feeling. The mood immediately rises, there is vigor, a burst of strength. My comrades experience the same, but why it happens, none of us can explain. The commander of the anti-aircraft battery, Senior Lieutenant Stasenko, nodding his head, tossing aside a stray strand of light blonde hair, explained the task assigned to the ship. We are to convoy the ships leaving Murmansk for England. Soon the Gremichny dropped anchor. We never managed to rest. Transports and tankers were slowly creeping along the Kola Bay. They were hiding behind the island of Sulny. A little earlier they went to see English cruiser Edinburgh. Went trotting ahead grinned Onokov, so as not to tie himself to the troubles with the caravan. The destroyers Gremichny and Sokrishitelny accompanied a whole floating city, dozens of ships. The sea, wrinkled by the gusty wind, rushed water bumps. Adjusting to the slow transports, we went all the time at slow speed, drawing an anti-submarine zigzag. Swing and watch, that's all. Boring? So the hours passed, the watches changed. Finally it was time to leave the caravan and turn for home. But Gremichny and Sokrishitelny, instead of that, suddenly increased their speed, bypassed the caravan and rushed forward. It turned out that A.I. Gurin on the radio received an order from the fleet commander, if possible, provide assistance to the cruiser Edinburgh. What else happened to it? Simultaneously burst out of Rozhkov and Vasiliev. Soon the situation became clearer. Cruiser Edinburgh, whose commander did not want to tie his hands with worries about the convoy, fished the sea away from the caravan. April 30th at 6 o'clock in the evening, at 200 miles to the north of the Rybaki Peninsula, he got to the position of a German submarine that released torpedoes on the cruiser. Their trace, as well as the periscope, the observers of the British ship did not notice. In addition, on the cruiser hydroacoustic device ASDIC was turned off. The British relied on the 20-knot course, believing that the submarine at such a speed of the target will not be able to come out to attack. They even abandoned the anti-submarine zigzag. So disregard for the enemy and blatant carelessness led to trouble. When our destroyers approached the damaged cruiser, it was moving at a slow pace towards the Kola Bay. The stern of the ship was destroyed by a torpedo explosion. A wide sheet of the upper deck was wrapped on the fourth gun turret. Rattling and crushing joined in guarding the now helpless hulk of a cruiser. At 11 p.m., the Edinburgh's machinery came to a standstill. Water began to pour into the compartments. A storm was brewing. At 4 o'clock in the morning, our destroyers were forced to leave the cruiser as fuel was running out. 2 British destroyers remained to guard the damaged ship. On the way to the Kola Bay, we met 3 British minesweepers, which, mercilessly smoking chimneys, hurrying to the aid of their wounded cruiser. Rattling and crushing went to the berths, took fuel, and went out to sea again. The storm had played itself out. The exhausting keel rocking exhausted even experienced sailors. We searched for a long time among the deserted greying sea. By the evening of May 2nd, Gurin received a radiogram from the commander of the Northern Fleet. If you are not busy saving the crew of the cruiser, then return to base. The cruiser has sunk. Wow. Our commander turned his head. Business. We learned the details a few days later. After our departure, cruiser Edinburgh found Nazi destroyers. They rushed to attack the ship left without a move. British destroyers tried to cover the cruiser with a smoke screen, but apparently thought not so much about saving the cruiser, but to get away from the blow. The smoke screen was blown aside by the wind. The damaged ship, helpless, defenseless, became an excellent target. One of the Nazi destroyers, approaching, fired torpedoes at point-blank range. Blasted by them, the ship began to lurch to the side and in 30 minutes sank. The destroyer escort managed to remove from it 740 people of the team. More than 50 sailors died. On the ship, with great enthusiasm, held a meeting on the occasion of the awarding of our fellow guards rank. The crews of submarines D3, M171, M174 and K22 earned this high rank. Besides, by the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the submarines M172, Shoch 402, Shesh and Shesh 401 were awarded the Order of the Red Banner. There is nothing to say. We were happy for our submarine fighting friends, proud of their deeds, and of course envious. The commander of the Northern Fleet AG. Golovko stopped at the pier near our ship. He was returning from the submariners. Talking with Gurin, Vice Admiral pointed to the right 45mm gun destroyer and asked, "How many airplanes shot down the calculation of this gun?" 2 bombers shot down and some damaged, shot up to a dozen floating mines, detected 3 submarines in bad weather. "You already have this corner of the guards," smiled Commander. "Make sure that all the battle stations on the Gremichny became the same." Hearing this phrase, my comrades cheered up. Good advance gave us Komflota. We hindered the gunner of the 40-pot gun, Sailor Grigory Babich, jokingly calling him the first guardsman. We fought even better after that. I looked through my hurried notes of those days. Here is a note about how we were escorting a caravan of transports. 25 Nazi bombers attacked the ships at sea. Escort ships opened fire from all guns and machine guns. In the air hung a thick cloud of fire and smoke. Only 2 planes overcame this veil. One rushed to the nearest transport from us, and the other to Gremichny. Either Domrin was worried, or the sharp rocking interfered, but he, pointing at the plane, could not bring a light line of tracer shells under it. Dark drop from the plane came off the bomb. It hit the bow of the transport, ripped its left cheekbone, dived into the water, and exploded 3 meters from the side of the ship. "Ah, you bastard! You're lying, you won't get away," shouted Domrin after the junkers coming out of the dive. The gunner has already become accustomed to the rocking. In the tail of the plane struck a shell, followed by a second. The tail crumbled, and junkers, with engines howling at full speed, fell into the water. "Here we have worked off the advance of the fleet commander," taking a breath, smiled Petty Officer Petrov. But it was not possible to take a final breath. The second airplane slid into a dive on the Gremichny. The destroyer increased its speed. On the bridge, choking, dragged large-caliber machine gun Permanov. He echoed machine gun Zaitsev. The sailors were hitting the enemy in the forehead with vicious bursts. The Vulture let off smoke, but still dropped bombs. They fell along the stern without harming the ship. On the way back, the Gremichny was detected by 2 enemy aerial scouts. They tried to imitate the bombardment of the ship, but anti-aircraft gunners Senior Lieutenant Stasenko accurate shots forced them to stay away from the Soviet destroyer at a respectful distance. At sea, our commander received a cipher in which the commander of the Northern Fleet warned our crew about a possible meeting with 3 enemy destroyers. 1 against 3. Well, so be it. Rattling changed course, and air scouts in the coming gloomy twilight lost sight of us. On the bridge for a few minutes gathered all the commanders of combat units. Having received Anton Iosifich's instructions in case of meeting with a detachment of fascist ships, They soon dispersed to their places. An alarming silence was established at the posts. However, the enemy did not show up. Gremichny, without incident, returned to the Vienne raid, as always perfectly fulfilled the combat mission. A few days later, heading towards the next caravan, we discovered the periscopes of 2 submarines. Our miners Petty Officer Osipov and Sailor Panchenko dropped dozens of depth bombs on them. One of the boats after the explosion of our bomb showed its deckhouse. The boat still got away, but undoubtedly we damaged it a lot. We joined the guard of the caravan. Soon the sharp-eyed Lisnev reported. Torpedo. Left aft. A narrow, bubbly track stretched past Gremichny to the nearest transport. Fortunately, it didn't hit. The guard ships drove the boat into deep water. The caravan passed the dangerous place without losses. Suddenly a snow squall struck. The sea turned white. A 9-point storm was brewing, so swaying on a steep wave, the destroyer Gremichny passed the positions, as we knew, 8 Hitler submarines. None of them dared to attack the ships. But the same indefatigable Lisnev discovered a whole field of floating mines along the course of the convoy. It was the work of fascist submarines. On the signal of Gremichny, the convoy bypassed the dangerous area. They just returned to the base as a fascist reconnaissance airplane appeared at night over Polony. It was grabbed by searchlight beams. The shore anti-aircraft battery and our signalman gunner Pyotr Lisnev, who was on watch at that time, opened fire first. The Vulture was shot down. We must assume that it will be recorded in our combat account, for the machine gun trace fired by Lisnev whipped the plane's engines. Early in May, our ship was going out into one of the bays of Motovsky Bay for artillery support of a marine landing force. For several hours in a row, we were firing intensively at troop concentrations and enemy strongholds. We spent 240 fragmentation and armor-piercing shells. Infantrymen warmly thanked for the rescue. From June 1st to June 5th, destroyers Gremichny, Grozny and Kuibyshev escorted a large caravan of ships headed from Murmansk to England. During the campaign, we discovered and attacked 4 enemy submarines. Grozny bombed 3, Kuibyshev 1. Attempts of fascist pirates to strike at our convoy failed again. June 1942 was good. There were clear sunny days and nights over the Kola Bay. Once in a while a naughty summer breeze broke through here from somewhere from the Kilda shoulder, through wrinkled strips of ripples on the water, and rushed on. It was dry, which is rare in the polar region. In the air was not felt even the vapour of the swamps surrounding Murmansk. These days the destroyer Gremichny stood at the side of a floating workshop moored at a small pier in the village of Drovyanoi. From here the polar city spreading on the heights was clearly visible in an amphitheatre. Each of us had a lot of things connected with it. Some of us had relatives living there, others friends and acquaintances. Going out on the upper deck, we sailors looked at Murmansk for a long time, and our hearts clenched with anger. Many stone buildings in the centre of the city lay in ruins. Blackened were the fires. Every day bombs fell on Murmansk. Murmansk people extinguished fires, repaired broken houses, worked in the port, on the railroad, at the shipyard. The city remained a tireless worker and fighter. Once at noon a squadron of fascist bombers was approaching Murmansk. It was coming from the sunny side at high altitude. On the Gremichny they played an air alarm. On the anti-aircraft bridge with binoculars at his eyes froze Stasenko. Fingers, clutching binoculars, turned white from the tension. Around the bombers grew wisps of ruptures. Murmansk anti-aircraft gunners opened barrage fire. Enemy planes, trying to bypass the fire screen, changed course and approached us. Stasenko shouted, "Point the guns." Gremichny trembled from the frequent shots of anti-aircraft guns. One of the bombers smoked, but did not turn from the course. The fascist pilot, having thrown the plane almost in a steep dive, was aiming at the house of intervoyage rest of sailors. However, the fascist failed to drop his cargo on the palace, which stands to this day. A few moments later, the bomber, which was lower than the rest of the flock of Junkers, exploded. When the smoke cleared, we saw that the airplane under which the explosion had occurred had caught fire. Apparently, it had been hit by shrapnel. Sailors of ships standing in the roadstead of the Kola Bay, Residents of Murmansk saw how this dive bomber instantly burst into flames. Only one pilot, who had used a parachute, fell out of the smoke and fire. This episode played out in front of the workers who were repairing our ship. They long and warmly applauded anti-aircraft gunners Gremichny. This was the famous duplet of the Gremichny gunners, which was much talked about in those days in Murmansk and in the whole Northern Fleet. Assistant Commander Vasiliev and a group of sailors rushed to the dinghy. The pilot of the downed airplane was floundering in the bay. He was pulled out of the water. On the ship, the commander ordered to give the captured pilot medical aid and feed him. The angry sailors were perplexed. He came to destroy Murmansk, to kill women and children, and we are babysitting him. He should be thrown overboard, not treated in the infirmary. But the commander's orders are the law. In the infirmary, the Nazis' scratches were smeared with iodine. Then we fed him our wonderful buckwheat porridge. After that, the captured pilot was taken to the commander's cabin. There the fascist obsequiously pulled out of his pockets their contents. There were documents, a nickel-plated lighter, coupons for margarine and for visiting. To a brothel in Tromsø. In the wallet was a postcard. On it was written in a woman's handwriting, "I wish you happiness in 1942. "The bastard has waited for his happiness," said Vasiliev quietly. "He'll live in captivity." It turned out that we shot down a large bird. The pilot was a Knight of the Order of the Iron Cross and a special medal for combat sorties. Before that he served in France, Bond, London and other English cities. On his account, hundreds of combat sorties, 36 shot down and destroyed on the ground airplanes of the French, British and Americans. On the Soviet front it was only his second flight. And the last. Summarized the interrogation by the commander of the ship. There came a dryness, which even the old residents of Murmansk did not remember. The heat was unusual. The deck of the Gremichny heated up like a frying pan. On June 18th, sirens blared ominously in the pale glow of a hot and quiet day. Air alarm. Ships and coastal anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on enemy planes. 2 of them managed to shoot down. The rest still broke through to the city and dropped incendiary bombs. Fires broke out in Murmansk. Wooden houses caught fire like gunpowder. Soon the whole city was in smoke and fire. And fascist planes kept flying and flying. Our fighters fought in the sky above Murmansk to the last drop of gasoline in the tanks, to the last cartridge and shell. Anti-aircraft batteries, warships and transports were firing without ceasing. Some of the bombers turned off course, throwing lighters into the bay and on the hills, but many broke through to the city. And from the sky, until then so tender and gentle, flew on people fire and death. The sailors could not calmly watch the city burning. The air was still shuddering with gunfire when Gorin ordered the boats to be lowered. 20 sailors rowed as hard as they could. Having crossed the bay, they ran along Lenin Avenue. It was possible to move only in the middle of the sidewalk, but even here there was nothing to breathe from the unbearable heat. Sailcloth shirts on sailors were smoking. At the big house stood the bewildered firemen. "Why do you delay?" The sailors jumped on them. "What should we do?" A grey-haired fireman with a helmet pulled over his eyes replied sullenly, "See?" He pointed to the hoses. They were burned in many places, and water was pouring out of them before they reached the barrels. The men stood black, exhausted. The paint on the fire trucks was charred. "We need a sea of water, and where can we get it?" said the fireman, and rushed to the aid of his comrades, who were pulling the flaming logs with buggers to prevent the fire from spreading. I myself did not have a chance to be in Murmansk at that time. We continued the battle with enemy planes. Comrades told us about what was happening in the burning city afterwards. A woman in a torn blouse, with dishevelled hair, was thrashing around a wooden house on Perovskaya Street. She was wringing her hands and moaning. "My daughter. My daughter." "Where's your daughter?" Jumped up to her our art electrician Alexander Volkov. The woman, sobbing, pointed to the house. Volkov, without thinking, threw himself into the flames. The rest of the sailors, grabbing buckets, basins, troughs taken out by the inhabitants, rushed around the corner to the water dispenser. Get in line. A lively chain was formed. Sailors and women from hand to hand passed the dishes with water. For a short time the flames outside were knocked down, but the smoke grew thicker and more suffocating. Meanwhile Volkov, panting, barely able to keep on his feet, moved from room to room to room by touch. "Girl, where are you?" He found her after all. She was huddled behind the stove, crying. Clutching the child to his chest, Volkov ran, dodging the sparks from above, the tongues of flame blazing everywhere. When he appeared in the doorway, a burned beam fell on his shoulder. Alexander staggered, took a step forward, and, already falling, held out the girl to the distraught mother. The sailors dragged Volkov away from the house, poured water on the clothes that caught fire on him. And this house could not be saved. Before the sailors' eyes the fire was devouring the city. Stone buildings turned into charred, dilapidated boxes, wooden ones into ashes. At the risk of being burned alive, the sailors from the Gremichny ran from one burning house to another. They managed to pull out of the fire 2 old people, a sick woman with a child. They helped to carry out the inhabitants' property. A sunny June day over Murmansk turned into black twilight, bitter with smoke and stench. A dense, suffocating shroud hung over the city. Black from soot, burned in burnt clothes. Only by evening our comrades returned to the ship. 105 fascist airplanes attacked Murmansk that day. It was a barbaric robbery raid on a peaceful city. We surrounded the commissar on the Utes. Alexander Ivanovich, like everyone else, was pale, shocked, but his voice sounded firm and calm. "Chin up, sailors. This raid speaks not only about the fierceness of the fascists, but also about their impotence. They are trying to wipe our Murmansk off the face of the earth because they have finally lost hope of ever entering it." Yes, after the May operation of our troops, which destroyed the enemy's reserves, the Nazis refused to capture Murmansk. They made an attempt to scorch the city, but it did not succeed. Murmansk was badly damaged, but it lived. In the port we saw it, ships were loading. From the side of the ship repair plant came the blows of hammers and the noise of machinery. In the morning when we left for sea, clouds of smoke still hung over the city, but the flames of fires were no longer visible. The population selflessly defended the factories and residential areas. Murmansk lived. It stood by the sea, like a wounded warrior, despite everything ready to fight.